Good afternoon. This is Unsafe Country podcast. I'm its author and host, Alina Frolova, and I'll be talking to you about the security. Security, each of us, security of the country, of Europe, of the world, how things are going on around us, what are events which can principally influence on our life, when the war will end up and what is the victory, how we shall achieve it, what is the position of US, what is the position of NATO, what is the future of European security. So we have so many questions, but a little bit of answers as for now. This podcast is produced jointly by the Center for Defense Strategies, Ukrainska Pravda, and Media Center Ukraine. You can find us on resources of Ukrainska Pravda as well as on largest podcast platforms Apple, Google, Spotify, SoundCloud, and other. Don't forget to subscribe and to receive updates and join new episodes. This episode, we will speak about the research technologies. And actually, we all live in the world of so-called open source intelligence systems, or shortly OSINT technologies. How these technologies are influencing our life, how is these technologies influencing the course of war, of current war, of many wars before. We will speak with one of the specialists on this regard. And I'm welcoming here Jakub Janovsky, OSINT analyst, author of numerous studies on OREX and Bellingcat resources. Jakub, welcome.
Nice to talk to you.
Let's start from what is OREX? What is that and why it's somehow appeared in this war as one of the players?
Okay, so OREX is originally Dutch-based block that has been writing on various military conflicts based on open source intelligence information and analysis. Originally, it started focusing on civil war in Syria and other conflicts. Later, it became for detailed insight into tracking of equipment losses during the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh a few years ago. And when it became clear in early 2022 that Russia will most likely attack Ukraine, we agreed again to count those losses in this conflict. Originally, the block was started by a team of two analysts in Netherlands, but those have by now retired, and the block is now operated by myself and the rest of the team. Currently, about 3 or 4 active regularly contributors, with others helping occasionally.
Oh, this is only 3 or 4 people, because it was my next question, how big is community? But actually it's quite small one, let's say so.
Yeah, and we are essentially doing it in our spare time, not as a job. Besides, people can send us some few euros for a coffee or something, but otherwise we have no nation state or organizational funding or things like that.
Haven't you seen to turn it into some kind of profession of you and for the whole team? Never thought about it?
Some people in this community want to turn it into a job, but in most cases, governments and related agencies or think tanks are just too stupid to hire people from this community.
Well, I'm representing here also think tank, and I should tell you I like open source intelligence, and I consider it is one of those technologies which really changed the course of operation, not only in war, but in many other aspects of our life. And this is actually, let's speak about the OSINT technologies, how you see them for now, because they're actually used now by governments. So we know that intelligence services are actively also used the open sources. They're used by the journalists for some kind of investigation, journalist investigation, and identifying some facts. We see its application in war. We see its application in some kind of academia. So what's the role of OSINT and how you see the development of this technology, how influential it would be in the nearest future?
Well, I'll start by saying that OSINT is in practice very old, because either in journalism or in the study of military conflicts, nobody ever scoffed at free information, no matter what the source was. Obviously, you need to take into account if the source might want to mislead you in some way or things like that. But in general, this has been a very old practice. it just became much more useful and more practical for tracking ongoing military conflicts in the age of social media and everyone having self access to cell phones and things like that. Because previously it was mostly based on analyzing government reports, things like in newspapers and things like that. But by now, you have random people involved in these events as essentially sources that are posting useful information, which you need to obviously analyze. You need to determine how valid their claims are. But in general, I would say that this is just new use of already old and known methods. Obviously, because we now have a lot of posts like drone footage or other visual documentation, it makes it much more easy to verify those claims on social media and elsewhere, because you can often use what you can see in the either image or video to, for example, geolocate the event. You can identify specific equipment, and in some cases, if it's sufficiently important event, you might, for example, track the equipment as it moved over some territory or did something, if it was filmed by multiple people, as it happened with Russian back launchers that shot down MH17 years ago. So it's obviously a matter of how important any specific event is, because, for example, if somebody posts an image of a burnt out Russian truck, nobody is probably going to bother to track down, or very few people are going to bother track down which unit specifically it belonged to, or maybe who drove it and things like that. But if it's something sufficiently high important, you can dig down quite deep and get a lot of information in many cases, not always. So it really also depends on how many resources and how much time people doing this work have for any specific task.
You mentioned the MH17 case. Where are your data on this case or on some other cases ever been used as proofs in trials, in courts, in proving the guilty of some party or proving some kind of cases analysis?
Oryx block wasn't involved in this case. It was tracking different information. But from what I recall, Bellingcat investigation was mentioned in MH17 criminal trial of Russian suspects. And I think there was also involvement of data from Bellingcat investigation in one of the cases where International Criminal Court, from what I remember, has been seeking the arrest of someone based on what has been posted as open source intelligent analysis. So there is potential there. Obviously, it depends on how good sources you have for that specific event to have happened, and if you have sufficient evidence in open source, or if you need to rely more on non-public sources and things like that. It really depends on case by case. But after all, jails are full of stupid criminals, so it's inevitable to happen, at least in some cases.
You also mentioned now Bellingcat, which is quite popular here in Ukraine, starting from some period, because they do quite a good investigations, including investigation about Russian policies and so on. And am I right that you are cooperating with them on the project which they now do on registering the losses among civilian population, registering hitting in civilian infrastructure, and they put it all on interactive map and therefore giving some kind of visibility picture of war? This is the project you cooperate with?
No, I wrote several articles about Syrian civil war for Bellingcat. That is the extent of my contribution there.
Okay, so and usually in movies when they describe the work like you do, yes, it's very glamorous and fancy. Yes, you have many monitors, you just input some information, and database started to switch a different type of equipment, and ta-da, on the screen you see the fitting of the equipment type. Is this how you work? Well, how the whole process is happening, where you take the sources of information, how you verify them, how you match this equipment type, how you do understand that something gets wrong with equipment.
Okay, so I'll describe a bit of typical day. I get home at 8 p.m. from my work, sit in front of my computer with a dinner, and start gathering what new content we have from that day. Some of it is from Telegram, some of it is from Twitter. Usually, we use accounts that collect this information from multiple sources, and so we don't need to check, let's say, 200 Telegram accounts or things like that for what they have posted. These people usually do at least basic check if it's not like at least recent repost and things like that. And we collect information from various sources like this. We check with colleagues if, let's say, somebody spots some error somewhere, either a duplicate or something, we immediately rule it out. And from content we deem to be likely new or not yet documented, because in some cases you might have months or even years old losses that remain unseen or undocumented, either because it's a remote area not accessible due to unexploded munitions and mines and things like that. We are still, for example, seeing some losses that weren't yet documented from last year's Kharkiv offensive, and that being over a year, simply because either nobody bothered to, let's say, photograph that piece of equipment, or we didn't notice it from our usual sources, so we might only discover it later. After that, we'll check if we can determine whose equipment it was. Sometimes it's clear from the equipment ID, it's painted IFF signs, flags, things like that. In other cases, you need to like work with the geolocation, determine when, where the equipment was lost. For example, if that position changed hands multiple times, because in that case, maybe it was Ukrainian tank, maybe it was Russian one. But if you, for example, determine that the loss happened before Russia occupied some area, it's obviously Ukrainian. On the other hand, if you can determine that it happened while Russia occupied the area, you can clearly identify it as a Russian one. Like I said, flags, equipment surrounding the equipment, for example, prepared meals that are clearly identifying crew as Russian or Ukrainian, or personal equipment. There are some, let's say, crew bodies or equipment they have left behind. All this obviously helps. And some equipment is simply unique for one side or another. Russia isn't operating Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, and Ukraine is not operating Su-35 fighter jets. So in some cases, identification is way easier. In some cases, it's difficult. For example, if it's T-72B tank, it might not be possible to determine who operated it, in which case it doesn't get listed on either Russian or Ukrainian list. It will be kept in separate storage where we have unknown operator equipment. And over time, this may be revised if we get additional information. In case we can identify the operator with reasonable certainty, we try to identify exactly what equipment it is, which sometimes we can identify down to the exact model of vehicle or artillery piece or other equipment. In other cases, the footage might not be of sufficient quality. Maybe it's, let's say, a long distance drone video showing destruction of some tank. So we might be able to identify it, let's say, as just unknown T-72 variant or unknown tank, and we add it into the list as such. And later, if better footage appears, we'll revise it with better identification. But that doesn't always happen. So some vehicles are simply destined to stay in this category. And after that, somebody, which in case of Oryx block is me, needs to take relevant images, screenshots, any other documentation we might have. For example, if, let's say, it's an aircraft that crash or lost somewhere, we might have a pilot's death announcement and things like that. And we might attach that as well and link it to our new entry on the list. And usually every 2 or 3 days, I post an update on the website after manually adding all this.
Yeah, doesn't look like very fancy stuff.
Not exactly a James Bond movie.
Now we have a lot of technologies like IE and artificial intelligence and others, and deepfake, for example. Have you been ever facing a deepfake, like misleading or any other misleading technologies which were tried to be injected in your work, influenced your work, or which were used by some parties to mislead the figures?
We have seen misleading images in general. It's like somebody either deliberately or just by accident filming already known loss from another angle. In some cases, it's clear that it's deliberate, but in most cases, it's just like a 10th person passing the same wreckage and filming it thinking it's new or recent. So that happens. We have also seen some photoshops and things like that. I don't consider it to be a great concern for our work, because most equipment losses are not generally worth so much effort to make a good fake. Most people who try are not very good at it. But I think it would be concern for something, let's say, high profile, let's say some important piece of equipment or things like that. But we rarely interact with those. Unfortunately, Russia isn't losing strategic bombers left and right yet. But what we have seen is like deceptive reposting of same losses again and again from different angles. Let's say once from the ground, once from the drone, or from different angles and things like that. For us, AI manipulation isn't that much of a concern because if they recreate some scene completely, either it will match some known location and details will likely not fit exactly, or it will create a new location which you can geolocate, and like the amount of effort it would take to, let's say, fake another destroyed T-72 isn't worth to anyone. If somebody submits, let's say, perfect fake, which would take incredible amount of work of, let's say, Ukrainian T-64BB or Russian T-72B, it's not going to make a difference. So maybe someone can do it to make a point, but I seriously doubt it's worth anyone's time. Like if, let's say, tomorrow there was an image of burning some super high end, extremely rare and important equipment, like yes, and that in that case, like we would look at that submission more suspiciously than on regular ones. But it always depends on circumstances if we have additional evidence and things like that. But overall, I don't think AI fakes are a big concern for us, at least for now, because it's very complicated to do a believable fake. And at the same time, AI is not yet useful for our work, at least not without extensive nation state resources to make a good AI, let's say, identify things and, let's say, rule out known losses and things like that. For that, we don't have enough resources.
I see. So Oryx is the project which monitors losses of equipment of Russian in Ukraine in this war. Yes. So, and your figures, and I know that this question is like a multiple ask to you, but your figures and figures which are officially stated by Ukrainian forces are quite different about, for example, Russian losses, yes, of equipment. Russians don't post any figures at all, which can be relevant or somehow taken seriously. So, what is your evaluation and what are the trends which you see in this war? How realistic the figures? And do you have some, I don't know, understanding of human losses, about the personal losses in this war?
Yeah, well, I'll start with manpower losses, and I'll state clearly that we are not dealing with tracking manpower losses. It's incredibly complicated work with huge margins of error, and it's also more stressful work as well. We prefer to stay with equipment, which is our lane and our specialization. We might have opinions on those claims, but we generally avoid dealing with manpower losses because outside of narrow case of like single battle that is well documented, it's extremely hard to document from public information, and especially without access to classified intercepts and things like that. What we do is simply tracking equipment losses. And in regards to both Russian and Ukrainian claims, I would point to historical research about claims compared to actual losses that have been done around earlier wars, let's say war in Vietnam or Second World War and things like that, where after the war, for example, United States government agencies went over their own units' record of various claims, so let's say aircraft shootdowns, and compared them to what Japan and Germany and Italy were actually suffering at the time. And there has been huge gaps, like easily in multiples of in terms of like difference between claimed shootdowns and actual ones. And there were many reasons for it. People might even genuinely think that they have destroyed something, but maybe it was damaged, maybe they have missed, and just, let's say, aircraft started smoking, which might be just smoke from engine and not actual damage. Or let's say you might hit a tank with RPG. Maybe that tank will in 5 minutes completely burn out. Maybe it just blew up an air block and did no actual damage inside. Or maybe it hit frontal armor and just did nothing. And determining that is a lot more complicated. And especially when you are under stress in combat, you are not likely to have very good memory. You might have only seen that vehicle briefly or it's traveling at some speed. If your rocket landed 2 meters in front of it or hit it, might not be recognizable. You might see just tank being obscured by some dust or smoke and things like that. Also, you might have a case of multiple units fighting in same area and so claiming the same loss to their command. So suddenly from one actual tank that was destroyed, you might have 2 or 3. And there is not exclusively Soviet tendency to round up errors and count numbers as they progress along the chain of command. So if squad reports 2 destroyed BMPs, it might end up as a company by the time it reaches one or the other command headquarters. So if you combine all these plus like usual like errors in human judgment, you very quickly arrive to the conclusion that these reports, unless they are clearly investigated with people checking like locations reported and things like that for various losses in the same area, it's very easy to quickly get significant error margin in what is being reported. And overall, I consider reported numbers, especially for any error losses, to be highly problematic because in many cases it's simply that unit tracked some aircraft or what they thought to be an aircraft and they lost a radar track. Maybe they hit it with a missile, maybe the missile hit and they just lost the radar track. Maybe it wasn't an aircraft in the first place. For example, someone shooting at what they think is an enemy fighter jet flying low at night. It might have been cruise missile instead of an aircraft. So even if they shut it down, it's still a missile, not an aircraft. And so completely different equipment and something that would have landed somewhere anyway. So I suggest to people to completely disregard claims about air losses for both sides because their error rate tends to be very significant, usually like 3 to 4 times the real losses, and sometimes like complete nonsense, to be frank. In terms of like ground equipment, I would say that in terms of equipment losses, margin of error is smaller, but still you have the same issues of like somebody shooting at the equipment and either missing and thinking it was destroyed or hitting and just damaging or to some smaller or greater extent and not actually being destroyed. And some of the equipment will be repaired later. On the other hand, some of the damaged equipment might be stripped for parts because it's not worth repairing or because that unit, for example, urgently needs to fix 3 other ones with those parts. And at that point, that wreck is unusable. So you might have cases where something was just damaged but end up being complete loss. On the other hand, many claims of destruction will turn out to be just damage. And here I would say that there is also a gap in OSINT data in terms of damaged equipment because most equipment that was damaged will never be filmed or photographed and will just be towed away by a respective site to the rear without us seeing it. And maybe it will be repaired, maybe it will be scrapped. Plus, there will be inevitable on both sides, essentially loss, what could be counted as a loss, where you need to maintain certain amount of equipment. You don't have enough spare parts, and you decide to strip equipment that either malfunctioned or have some other issue to repair other vehicles for the unit. So I suspect that some of the vehicles that wrecks that ended up on scrapyards on both sides belong to this category. For example, BMP engine and transmission are completely trashed so that it would need new ones, but you may have many other useful parts on the vehicle and you have urgent need to fix others without like sending them to the factory or some other repair facility. It happens.
Okay.
So it's complicated.
I just checked on your site and like I compare today data, for example, of our armed forces about tanks, and the data twice differs. Yeah, there are a lot of factors which you mentioned about that your data is not full. Our data, like a data of the armed forces, are sometimes exaggerated of different reasons. But still, from our side, this war looks like of hyper intensity. But we are here inside this war, and of course, we have a lot of emotions and a lot of personal perception. You saw Syria, from your point of view? Yes, you saw Armenia, Azerbaijan, now you see Ukraine. Do you think that this war is really big one? Do you think that it's really like enormous losses of equipment, of people? How serious you perceive this war is?
Well, it's obviously on much bigger scale, but in terms of like individual battles, for example, fighting on like Nagorno-Karabakh territory between Armenia and Azerbaijan was like fairly comparable to some individual battles in this war, but just like representing individual battles, not like the whole war. Because in that case, you also had like hundreds of equipment pieces being lost on both sides in fairly intensive combat and use of lots of fairly modern equipment on both sides. But Syria was in general mostly much less intense combat with like some exceptions. So Ukraine is definitely much bigger scale overall, and it has also some aspects that prevents like making it good comparison with those early ones, because if you are waging fairly small level war, let's say between Armenia and Azerbaijan, losses on both sides in terms of material can, if you have either foreign supporters or enough money to throw around, you can replace, let's say, 200 lost T-72s or BMPs fairly easily. Once you go into thousands, where even Russia is depleting its ex-Soviet storage depots, you suddenly don't have like good external sources of replacements besides what you can make, at least on the Russian side. In case of Western supporters of Ukraine, it's a bit more complicated because they have some equipment in storage, but still not all of it is usable, or it takes time to repair it. But once someone is losing, let's say, 2000 BMPs, there is like no magical source where you can like throw some briefcase cash on someone and like get replacements for that equipment, especially in terms of like impact of sanctions that supplying equipment to Russia, for example, would have for many countries. And we have seen from leaked intelligence information earlier this year that, for example, Egypt first agreed to sell Russia some artillery ammunition, but after American pressure, actually ended up supplying Ukraine. Or at least not supplying Russia at first. From my understanding, they later sold ammunition to Ukraine indirectly. And we have seen cases like that. So obviously, international situation around this conflict is very different. Almost nobody cared if Armenia or Azerbaijan will get like doesn't replacement tanks or extra artillery ammunition or things like that. There wasn't like big US or other Western nation pressure on sanctions and things like that during those smaller conflicts. And to be frank, many of those sanctions around those conflicts were a bit of a joke, even more than they are towards Russia. So I think comparing those conflicts is extremely difficult. And there are many aspects that make the war in Ukraine unique in terms of like analysis and conclusions that you can make from the war and things like that. So people definitely need to be very careful about what they predict based on what they are seeing in Ukraine. There are unique circumstances we are seeing. For example, one of the big ones is that neither side has air superiority. If either side tomorrow got air superiority, battlefield would look very different. And the same can be said about presence or lack of presence for certain equipment, technology, and things like that.
General Zaluzhny, our chief of defense, in his latest article, which caused a lot of discussions here in Ukraine, and would be interesting to hear from you also whether you discussed it or not. But he said that we already in the war which has no fog of war, because Russians can see everything with the drones of them and with all the system observation system, monitoring system, what's going on Ukrainian side, and Ukrainians can see everything what's going on Russian side. And does it mean that you also, are you agree with this? I mean, that is this like this?
Mm-hmm.
And how deep we can see and them can see, and how deep you can see, whether you see, for example, the storage of the equipment which they have, and are you using somehow this information?
Well, I mostly agree with that statement. I will add a caveat that what we have as a publicly available information is a fraction of what military on either side has. For example, drone footage from individual units, all that is collected and analyzed. We also usually, when even if we get, let's say, some footage, we might lack additional data that would be automatically provided within the military structure for exact locations and things like that, which might not, especially at night, be easy or doable to determine on our end independently. And there are some factors that makes this different from other conflicts or different circumstances. For example, you might have another conflict where armed individual actors, what equipment they have in storage is actually in covered garages, which in case of Russia and Ukraine are small fractions of overall stored equipment. And so in this case, you can just buy satellite footage of those bases and with a reasonable amount of accuracy get counts of what is actually there still. And at least with higher resolution satellite images, rule out those that are wrecks that appear to be beyond repair, at least the worst cases of those. So it really depends on what level of access you have. For general frontline area, let's say gray zone plus 10 miles behind the front line, there is very little you can hide. There are some exceptions and some circumstances. For example, while you can't hide everything from drones, or you can still make life of opponent difficult if, you, for example, you accompany your assault force with large amounts of smoke artillery shells, so that like an enemy command might know that you are advancing, but their troops on the ground, let's say, trying to shoot at you, might not see you clearly, might only see part of the unit attacking them and things like that, which is something that like often makes me angry how little Ukraine is using smoke ammunition when supporting assaults. But like that's besides the point. That's matter of like tactics coordination and things like that, which like I understand that like especially before the war, Ukraine focused on like training and preparation for defensive combat, not for offensive operations. But it shows in many videos of Ukrainian assaults that it's not like as well coordinated as you would see, for example, in US military. So there are definitely like places where you can exploit certain amount of uncertainty that you can introduce, either using, let's say, conditions, natural conditions like fog, or like temporarily, let's say, exploit that you just got, let's say, a new jammer that can disrupt enemy drones, or you can use a lot of smoke shells to make it unclear exactly what are your positions, where you are attacking, and things like that. Obviously, and all of this is resource intensive and might require, let's say, receiving new equipment and things like that. But there are exceptions to that overall rule, which I agree that if you are, let's say, now trying to concentrate a battalion or brigade size force anywhere near front line, it will be spotted. Like on Russian side or Ukraine side, doesn't matter. Like with very few exceptions, it's very difficult to concentrate a lot of force on a small area and without like the other side noticing hours before you arrive. And so being able to like notify artillery, helicopter support, and things like that, which makes any breakthroughs much harder to achieve.
Actually, what you're speaking about, this is specifically what General Zaluzhny described in his article, that's all about the technologies. And the last question here, the war has changed now. The character of war, the operations in war, there is a lot of technologies which are influencing, including the public opinion. I mean, that this war is really going online, and public opinion is so important in decision making, and so it's influencing the war. And do you recognize that you're part of this like influence in public opinion? Because your data is like those data which other think tanks and some kind of influencers are referencing. They are proving their statement with your data. And do you feel this responsibility? And why are you doing this? This is the volunteer project. You have like quite a big scope of responsibility. Why are you doing this, and what is your role in this war?
Well, we definitely recognize that our data is being referenced quite widely by various sources and by various users. And as a result, we consider our work to be fairly important and for us to continue doing this. Otherwise, like we would have, if we didn't feel like our work is valuable, we would have stopped last year, because at that point it became like quite a hassle to do this all the time.
You was threatening to do this. It was a public information about that you're closing, yeah?
Well, the original creator of the Oryx blog has retired. That wasn't like maybe, that was like actually announced. He delayed a bit after my vacation in the United States, but like otherwise he deleted his main account on Twitter and he retired to some less stressful hobbies. But the rest of the team is still updating at least the main Ukraine war related loss lists. So this work is still ongoing, but it definitely takes its toll because like it's been very long war already, and amount of content that is published every day is quite substantial. So doing this almost every day obviously takes an effort. And at least in this case, we are getting credit. There are many other open source researchers doing work around this conflict or on other conflicts who don't get credit and quite often get their work outright stolen by either government agencies, government workers, or think tanks. I have seen this in my case where two think tanks flat out stole my work around Syrian civil war without any credit and actually sold that their analysis later to government. So I wasn't thrilled about it. In general, I appreciate that our work has impact in terms of information warfare, but we are doing the best we can in terms of accuracy, both for Russian and Ukrainian equipment losses. We think that accuracy is important, and while we are generally pro-Ukrainian, we don't think that, for example, hiding Ukraine losses would be in any terms of like beneficial to Ukraine. Because on one hand, yeah, sure, it would look nice if Ukrainian loss list wasn't so long, but it would also at the same time meant less pressure on Western governments to replace those losses because, hey, they lost only, let's say, 200 tanks instead of like, I don't know, 500 or whatever is the current number. So I think that our critics usually underestimate the value of making this list as accurate as possible, even if it comes to Ukrainian losses. And so, at least in my case, I feel like certain amount of responsibility for keeping this project going. It also helps to keep Western media focused at least a little bit on this war, despite all the other politics happening in individual countries and other conflicts that are meanwhile ongoing, which is something that I think Syrian efforts suffered from because it quickly became like 15th-page newspaper stories and things like that like didn't get attention of politicians and pressure to do something about this or that. So I think it's one of the aspects that also make our work important.
And I should tell you that here in Ukraine, we do appreciate it. It's really helpful.
Thank you.
And the truth is important because, the fog of war may be not so intensive on the battlefield, but it's quite intensive in information field. Thank you for work you do, for you, your team, and thank you for this conversation. It was very interesting for me. And I hope you won't close the project, and I hope you will find a way how to make it even bigger and more interesting for you. And thank you one more time for the conversation.
Thanks for inviting. Anytime.
And I would like to remind to our listeners that this was Unsafe Country podcast, and I'm its host, Alina Frolova. This podcast is a joint project of the Center for Defense Strategies, Ukrainska Pravda, and Media Center Ukraine, and you can find us on all the resources of Ukrainska Pravda as well as at the largest podcast platforms. Safe and safe country. It depends on each of us how soon the world unsafe will disappear. Thank you.